law matters? Of course it does. Welcome once again. My name is Debbie Moraes, your host and moderator. As we tell you, this long-running program continues to provide legal information, relevant examples, and practical assistance to help you with law matters. A better understanding of the law puts you in a better position to understand how to protect yourself, your family, and your business. As we present various topics, you may decide to handle some issues yourself. If you decide to enlist professional counsel, our hope is that you will be better prepared, that you will achieve the best possible results while saving some time and money. As always, we want to welcome and thank Attorney David Bazar from the Bazar and Associates law firm in East Providence, who continues to weigh in on the various topics that we discuss. Today, gun violence. And we sadly recognize, of course, the most recent tragedy in Texas with 19 children and 2 teachers. Today, the deadly intersection of guns and hate crime. From the recent headlines, there was the white supremacist Buffalo terrorist attack and a terrible aftermath. How can we prevent these kind of tragedies and disarm the hate? We've discussed in the past First and Second Amendments. We've discussed free speech, the right to bear arms. We've seen what happens, that free speech at times has impacted social media. It's brought some awful things happening, endless angst, endless debate, sometimes horror. And the Second Amendment, which we've talked about, that is that we have the right to bear arms, and that's also undergone such scrutiny and, of course, such challenges, and it is especially now. So we know right now that that intersection of hate crimes and guns has shattered so many lives. So where are we from a legal standpoint in terms of owning guns, social media and what can be said, what's proposed, what can be done? There are so many topics to discuss. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but let's begin. So, David, when we talk about hate crimes, I read and understand that it's awful, I guess most awfully represented by racial crimes. What constitute hate crimes? And
so when somebody acts against a group of people based upon their color of their skin, their race, their religion, any of those types of factors, then the federal law says that that constitutes a hate crime and has its own separate punishment above and beyond the crime that was committed itself. And when we first started talking about what we were going to speak about, we were only dealing with Buffalo at that time.
Right.
And then, of course, what happened in Texas happened, which is a whole nother layer of guns and gun protection and gun rights and all of those types of things. But in view of what happened in Buffalo and some of the facts that we know so far, and I know we don't know everything, was that the person who did that crime, and if it was a mass shooting, it's a crime for, murder and all of those types of things, but it was motivated based on hatred, or in this particular case, based on race hatred.
So, of late, I guess there have been more that have been added to the list. There's religious minorities, there's LGBTQ, there's even things that have happened in synagogues, in Walmarts, where Hispanic population is. Is it hard? How do they prove what's a hate crime? I mean, you can say that there's been a mass shooting. In this most recent case, it was all children and black children. Then there's all Hispanic children. Is it hard? How do they actually decide that this is going to be prosecuted as a hate crime? How do they prove
You have to look at the motivation of the person who committed the crime. And to figure out someone's motivation sometimes can be difficult. Sometimes it's not so difficult, especially if you can prove that they've left on social media or elsewhere a manifesto or a plan or whatever it is that triggered them and what their intent was and what they were trying to accomplish and why they were doing what they were doing. When someone leaves that roadmap, then it's pretty much, I think, fairly straightforward to go ahead and prosecute someone based on the enhanced penalties of a hate crime.
And you said that it becomes enhanced and federal. So I understand that the FBI right now has taken that on as one of the highest priorities that they have. And I guess once they're enlisted, that certainly means a longer time to interrogate and investigate if they can do that, if it isn't an open and shut case. How did the FBI get involved in that? Just because it's federal?
Well, there's overlapping jurisdiction for different types of actions or activity. So to use the Buffalo case as an example, someone goes and kills a number of people. There's obviously a state crime of murder being committed, and that's prosecuted by the Attorney General or District Attorney of the state of New York in that particular case. But overlapping that in this case is the potential for hate crimes under federal statutes, and that is then in the Department of Justice, the Attorney General's office for the state of New York, the District of New York. But in any event, the crimes are federal, so it's prosecuted in the federal courts.
And how does that play out in terms of consequences, in terms of punishment, assuming that the shooter isn't dead, there's standing trial? How do the consequences change when it's become declared a hate crime?
Depending on the particular crime or statute, there could be penalties up to including the death penalty in some instances, depending on exactly what the charges are and what's brought. So what happens, and we had our old dear friend Buddy Cianci to give us a good example of some of this, was when is a crime prosecuted by the state and when is it prosecuted by the federal government? I remember people asking Jeff Pine when he was the Attorney General, well, you prosecuted Governor DePrete, but the federal government prosecuted Buddy Cianci. What was the difference? And oftentimes there is communication between the different departments and the different folks with jurisdiction, and they look at it to say, where is there a better chance of success in the prosecution, and where is it more appropriate for the punishment that needs to be involved? And so the crimes that they said that Jeff Pine prosecuted the governor for really fell more squarely within the rules and statutes of the state of Rhode Island, whereas the federal government was the one investigating. And oftentimes it'll come out of who's doing the investigation. In that case, it was the FBI, so it's federal crimes they're investigating. If it's the state police, it would have been state crimes that they're investigating. So in Buffalo, it's concurrent. There's both. And I'm sure they're both doing their investigations and both doing their due diligence, and they're both working together. And once they sort out what it is they think they can do and what they think they can prove, they'll figure out who's going to prosecute and who'll take the lead. And they may both want to prosecute. I think the George Floyd, was both brought as some state criminal action and also civil rights violation on the federal side.
So referring to the FBI, they said that hate crimes is one of their priorities, and they are looking at it because it's such a civil human rights issue that they really want to step up regarding that. I don't want to derail the conversation, but I also have seen that they're looking at community outreach and letting people know in the community that they're trying to prevent these kinds of things from happening. But certainly, it looks like the level of success is questionable. Let's just say that for the moment.
On the prevention side.
On the prevention side, certainly. We've talked about hate crimes in the past where there wasn't a shooting, but just a hate crime. And I think we were talking about it when there was graffiti, I believe, and it was considered to be a hate crime because it was against a religious group.
Right, and motivated by hate of that religious group. And certainly, it doesn't have to be a murder to come to the level of a hate crime. If you deface cemeteries and put hate symbols of, in a Jewish cemetery, swastikas, I think is what the example was before. And you can show that that's obviously motivated to scare and and really go after one segment of the population, one group, because of who they are, then it's prosecuted as a hate crime.
And again, it carries with it a more severe penalty
It can,
once there's a
right.
conviction.
Right. So that's a hate crime probably as opposed to vandalism for defacing the property.
Good distinction. Good. So let's talk about guns then. Would you agree, and I guess you would, that in nearly decade-long between, Sandy Hook and what's happened in Buffalo, there have been so many congressional efforts that have been put forth to change our policies in some significant way, but they've been repeatedly failing, despite whatever the lawmakers try to put forth on gun control discussions. There's a new discussion every time there's a new attack, and they're all very harrowing. What do you see as happening now? Do you see that there's any single time when it will make a difference?
You would hope so. And it's hard to tell because now that's going into the world of politics, and people do what they do for different reasons rather than what you might do when you're just looking at the law itself. So if the question was, can the law be changed and not violate someone's Second Amendment rights and still try to protect someone? Well, the answer is yes. There's a lot of things you can do, a lot of what some people call common sense things that you could do, and a lot of things that gun owners would even agree to and people who don't like guns would agree to are ways of doing things without really trampling or impinging even at all somebody's constitutional right under the Second Amendment. So if you required somebody to be 21 instead of 18, does that violate someone's constitutional rights to be able to buy a gun? Probably not. If you required somebody to pass a background check, does that violate someone's rights to own a gun? Probably not. And there's a number of other types of things that could be done. So it would seem to me that it would make most sense, even politically, that there's a conversation about what can we agree to, what's common ground, and start with that, and then see where you can go from there.
David, as you distill it, it sounds so reasonable, almost to seem simple, even though it's not. And yet, as you distill it, I can't imagine anyone disputing what you're saying, and yet the actual bottom line is that nothing has happened really yet, even though there have been many overtures with various amounts of effort depending on the nature and the state of the crime or whatever, but clearly it hasn't happened yet. Maybe there will be an occasion where there is some degree that they can agree on common ground and move forward. But for example, when they were talking about young people who've been committing these crimes, parents being accountable, does that not sound, isn't a parent accountable and held responsible for what their children do under normal circumstances? Is that something that seems like it would be agreeable?
So it's an interesting area, actually. So if a child commits what would otherwise be a civil wrong, a tort.
A tort.
And injures somebody, is the parent responsible? There's actually a statute in some states that say up to $1,500 or some amount you may be responsible for what your child did. You may not be. Criminally, even more interesting, are you responsible for what somebody else does? Generally not, but there can be times where you are. And a good prosecutor, a good attorney general, district attorney may look at a set of facts and say, well, wait a minute, we're not going to hold you responsible for what someone else did or for what your child did. We're going to hold you responsible for what you did or didn't do. And my recollection is, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that I think it was in Michigan. Was it Michigan, where there was another school shooting by a child who went and had the gun with him and was in the principal's office, and they were talking to him, and he actually had hid the gun in the bathroom and went out and got the gun afterwards and shot some kids?
I seem to remember, but I don't know if it was Michigan, to be honest.
Okay.
But that sounds okay.
All right.
So
I don't remember exactly where it was.
Yep.
I was relying on you for that.
Sorry,
but
David.
That's okay. But in that case, my recollection is the parents who actually sort of fled and then they found them and arrested them and brought them back, they were charging them with what they did in getting that gun for the child and not appropriately supervising and allowing him to take the gun to school. I haven't heard anything on that in a while, but I think that was out there where the parents were charged.
And now, as I was looking at some of the state laws, Rhode Island and Massachusetts in particular, there are occasions where a 14-year-old can acquire a gun if the parent agrees to it and signs on to it. Now, if that happens and that 14-year-old has something that triggers, pardon the pun, it's a terrible one here, that causes that child to then commit a single murder, never mind mass shootings, at what degree, to what extent can the parents be held liable when in fact, or not liable, but responsible for what clearly was a direct result of a conscious choice that they made to enable that to happen? So
there is civil responsibility and criminal responsibility. Depending on the facts, again, the Attorney General or the district attorney or whoever it is that's responsible for prosecuting a crime can look at the facts and determine whether or not you as the parent were criminally negligent or responsible for what happened. And that's going to be a very fact-driven analysis. On the other side, there's always the possibility of civil liability. And I remember a case, I think in Rhode Island, where a son who was older and had some emotional or mental issues, was living in the basement, and the parents knew he had guns and rifles, and he got into a dispute with the neighbor and shot the neighbor. And the parents were sued in a civil suit for allowing that dangerous weapons and so forth to be in their basement with access to that child.
I recall it, yes.
Yeah.
So if we're not talking about children, but just in general, so under current federal law, a violent or threatening hate crime with a misdemeanor conviction, I guess it is, it still does not prohibit, as I understand, does not prohibit someone from buying or having a gun. Now, when you talk about some common sense laws, does that seem like it would be something they could possibly agree on if you already know that there's been hate crimes, a misdemeanor, not a killing yet? Wouldn't that be grounds to prohibit someone from buying a gun and doing something worse?
Domestic violence, generally, if you're charged with a criminal act of domestic violence, is generally can be a misdemeanor. It's a charge that can be used to keep somebody from keeping or possessing guns. It would seem to me that there are a number of misdemeanors that would either impact somebody's ability, whether you would want that person to be able to have a gun. And if I think there's red flag laws and that type of thing, so combine whether there's a crime or a charge or a conviction against somebody along with other concerns, I think there's, and oftentimes you'll hear a lot of politicians talk about whether it's the guns that are the issues or people with mental issues that are a problem and having access to guns. Well, why not pass laws that cover both and say that the access to guns can be limited for people who were concerned about having guns? And so whether it's a felony, a misdemeanor, or some mental issues, as long as the person has the right to get a hearing in front of a judge to determine whether or not those issues in fact exist, you should be allowed to regulate who can have guns even without violating the Second Amendment.
So I guess there are different states that either agree if you have a misdemeanor, no, you can't have a gun. Other states aren't weighing in on that. But there's, as you mentioned, that red flag law. If someone is determined to be a risk because they've already shown hate crimes or mental instability, apparently even that right now seems to be challenged because enough psychiatrists, I guess, have said that you can't really know whether or not that person who seemed like they were unstable would actually pose a risk. We don't know that for certain. I guess we could sign on to that and say, I agree. But does that also seem like that red flag would be an easy enough thing for someone to agree on? If they've come before the judge for some reason, or been arrested several times, or restrained, or whatever, is it a nuance there, or is it something that seems that could be passed with some common ground again?
So when we have just I'm going to say, run-of-the-mill personal injury case, for example, there are doctors who can look at the same set of facts and the same conditions and come up with different conclusions. That may happen in the red flag law situation too, but the point is you would have a judge who would hear all of the evidence from maybe both sides and then make a determination. And as long as there's an independent judge sitting there listening to the evidence and making a determination, that means that person who was being challenged to be denied the right to have a gun or a weapon had a fair hearing. And if you have a fair hearing and that maybe can be appealed and someone else can look at it, I think it's just, is there due process? And is the due process sufficient enough that we're not just going to violate someone's Second Amendment right? It's part of that right. To have that right, you have to at least meet certain qualifications that it's not going to be dangerous. And we talk about, I think there's, when justices in the Supreme Court look at things, they want to look at what's the impact on everything and weighing and balance some things. So there are some things that don't really need to be weighed and balanced. It is black or it's white. But sometimes there are things that are gray. And the right to have a weapon needs to be balanced against the safety of the population. And there's ways of doing that. So the long answer to your short question is, can that be done? And the answer is yes. But I would take it a step farther. The problem is having each state try to regulate who can have weapons and who can't. It's hard because you can go from one state to the next until you find the state where you can get it. That's why I think this cries out for some federal regulation that keeps you in the same playing field, so to speak, in every state, so that I can't go to state Y and take a gun, buy it, and go to state X with it and do what I'm going to do.
And while we're talking about what common ground there could be, and it does make sense that you're saying that it's a federal issue, apparently there is a Disarm Hate Act that's proposed. I don't believe it's passed, but it has to do with if someone has already been convicted of a violent crime, then certainly let's not enable that, or let's not give them a gun. I think that seemed to be a next reasonable step that might gain passage if someone's already been, due process has already been before the judge, has already been convicted, has already been determined to be unsafe, then at least hopefully that's something that they can agree on, even if there are so many other things that are in play.
Right.
Second Amendment rights, we've talked about that before. Now there's an issue about you can't get a gun at a gun store right now. Print one, those ghost guns. What's the status of that from what you know legally, and as you're hearing, what should be done relative to the fact that it's even easier now to not only buy one, but to make one?
Yeah, and I think if you listen to most people in law enforcement, that's a big concern, because if someone has a gun that's been made from a 3D printer, I guess, or however they do it, and it has no serial number, and you can't trace it, you can't solve a crime easily with it, it becomes an issue. And the regulations that go into any guns need to apply just as strongly, if not even more so, to the ability to print your own gun, so to speak.
So it seems that is the one place that the Second Amendment issue doesn't become one, because it's ghost guns, unserialized guns don't fall under the banner, and that may be at least somewhat of a deterrent or somewhat of protection, although relative to how easily people can buy them online and the rest, I'm not sure that all of that just puts a complete end to it, but it certainly is somewhat of a deterrent. What about, you mentioned earlier, background checks? Seems like that should be something that would be easy enough for people to sign on to. Suppose you happen to be, at least at this moment, among the dreamers, undocumented. How does that work with a background check? Unless you had been a convicted person or unless you'd been arrested, would you pass that background check?
Well, so there's always flaws in everything. Nothing's perfect. So it's not only whether or not that would show up if you had an undocumented status or something like that, but it's also the problem of communication between agencies in federal government and state governments as to what gets put into whatever system is used for background checks, because I remember hearing of situations where somebody had a charge on, say, a federal level, and when they looked into it for a state permit, it doesn't show up, it didn't get in there. So whatever we do in those types of things, it's going to require really good communication between states, or if it's federal, federal and states, so that all the information gets in when somebody looks something up.
So there's sometimes loopholes, sometimes it's an issue about how you can follow through on it. And the brief amount of time that we have left, the issue about open carry. Apparently there are studies that indicate when people see openly that there are guns, it seems to heighten their aggression, heighten their flight or fight instinct. So what do you think of that status right now and how that plays into the protection or the problems that we have?
Yeah, so that's again something I would want to defer to law enforcement folks on, and have feedback to whether or not they have a concern or issue with it, and how those permits are issued, and what background checks you have to go through for that, and that type of thing.
I know we've tried to keep out of the political realm. There's certainly football back and forth all the time about these issues. Do you think, certainly right now, it's only May as of this taping, 28 shootings that we hear, that have made the news. I'm sure there are more that are even with guns and suicide, never mind homicides and mass shootings. With knowing that it's a political year, how do you see that either favorably or unfavorably impacts on what legislation can go forward?
Here's the thing, and this is what I've been saying right along. This is such an important issue, and there's so many ways of approaching it on a common sense level. Find some common ground, find some compromise, get some things done, and take one step at a time. Don't try to do everything at once. Don't let great be the enemy of good, I think is what they might say sometimes. Let's just get some good legislation done and try to get things in where it's safer for everyone, especially our young children in school. Especially
for our young children. Thank you so much for tuning in to Law Matters. Let's hope for some good, if not great, legislation and some positive changes. Thank you for tuning in. Stay tuned to the Law Matters. It matters to you.